Well, good morning to all who are here. It is good to see you, even as we remember our absent brothers and sisters. One afternoon in early March 2009, about 15 minutes after a dismissal bell, I walked out of my classroom where I was teaching at the time at Germantown High School. I had just made a quick change of clothes, trading my slacks and a dress shirt for looser attire. I made my way around the corner, down a flight of stairs, through the main hall, out the door, down the exterior stairs, and up the sidewalk. Waiting in the parking lot were a few other teachers and several students. As more trickled in, we all stretched out together and made our plans. I fell in with two other beginning students. The lead teacher gave us our route around several Germantown blocks and back. My first run, all of 1 mile. And shout out, by the way, to Students Run Philly Style, an organization that gives city students running gear and training in a lifelong sport. Students Run and two of my students at the time gave me, as an adult who was not particularly athletic, the cover to take up running as a 29-year-old. It also brought me into a community of runners who are remarkably positive and supportive and passionate in what they do. It is only half in jest that I say running is cheaper than therapy, although I've had a few years of that as well. Weeks before my running began, I buried my maternal grandfather, who was a major influence and second father figure to me. In hindsight, that whole first year of running was an elongated grieving process. But anyway, it's still hard to believe that my first actual race would be 10 miles down Broad Street just a couple of months later. The starting line for the Broad Street run is a few blocks and within sight of where my children would be born a few years after that. The finish line, a mile and change from where some years earlier, before moving to Philadelphia, I had come to visit and wandered around at night and bought my first water ice from a little storefront on Broad Street run by some Italians. Since then, I've stood on Broad Street in demonstrations, watched parades, shook the governor's hand, trained for my job, gone to movies and theaters, attended a funeral, waited in line at 9 p.m. in winter in the dark for lamb and rice, gone to church, and well, any of you from the area get the idea. And as my first race was down this iconic street, amid thousands of fellow runners and thousands of onlookers cheering and yelling for us, one inevitably blasting the Rocky theme from an apartment window, someone else by a subway entrance playing the Pennsylvania polka, yes, Philadelphia, that's a thing, on an accordion, before we finally received our finisher medals and snacks in the Navy Yard. It's an amazing, uplifting experience. Well, Paul writes to the Corinthians in large part addressing a kind of factionalism among the believers there. The city of Corinth was a cosmopolitan city in a strategic location on an isthmus in Greece. The city had an active pagan cult that was part of civic life, complete with opportunities for ritualized adult activities, shall we say, and affordable meat from the sacrifices to the Greco-Roman gods. Corinth lay on a land route between Sparta and Athens, and the relatively calm Mediterranean bays on either side made it a fine stopover for travelers sailing between Rome and points east, such as Athens and Palestine. In this trade hub, some of the Corinthians had become wealthy, others quite the opposite. Some lived out in a libertine ethics and enjoyed the pleasures of this life, while others were far more restrained and took offense at conduct they thought was immoral. The passage we heard read a few moments ago comes at the end of an argument that Paul makes about Christian freedom. If you were to read all of chapter 9, the argument might seem a little bit convoluted. Paul walks a very fine line, trying to use himself as an example of being all things to all people. of asserting his rights as an apostle, then highlighting that he chose not actually to accept the benefits. On one hand, in a society in which rich patrons held sway over the clients who accepted their help, accepting Paul's right to compensation for his ministry and preaching might compromise his independence, or at least the appearance of it. On the other hand, turning down offers of support could give offense. Working with his hands to support himself would be seen by many as low class. So he was sort of in a no-win situation. Furthermore, in the culture of the time, it would have been very unseemly for a writer or speaker to, as we would say, toot his own horn. And it does sound like he's doing that when he holds himself up as an example to be followed. I think Paul knew that in the eyes of his readers, he was trying to have his cake and eat it too. And even if we can agree with a point he is making, and I do, the rhetoric of it all is a tough sell, and he does his best. But if we go on and read 2 Corinthians, another letter or parts of letters he wrote after 1 Corinthians, one might conclude that Paul's appeal here in 1 Corinthians 9 did not actually succeed in fostering the greater unity in Corinth. Nonetheless, two of the issues so divisive in Corinth were sexual behavior and diet. Paul's analogy would be apt, for those are and were historically two focal areas of an athlete's self-discipline. Where we read athletes in English, the original language refers not to weekend casual runners like myself, but to those who competed in a set of formal games in a stadium. And specifically, Corinth hosted its own version of the Olympics, which rivaled those Olympic Games and drew visitors and competitors from the entire region. Participants in those games at Corinth, like the Olympic Games, were required to adhere to strict codes of conduct and training for nearly a full year before the games. They would be disqualified from competing if they broke their discipline. Far more than supportive specters along Broad Street, those organizing and watching the Corinthian Games demanded dedication from those who ran and competed in them. Now, I said I started running in spring of 2009. I say that I became a runner about a year and a half after that. I had run about 8 miles on Forbidden Drive one chilly November morning, and for those who know the area, I was on the long uphill climb back to my vehicle on Rittenhouse Street. I slowed to a walk about halfway up the hill, and it suddenly felt like a mistake. It felt harder to move. So I started jogging again. That was the moment in my mind when, despite the fatigue and the incline, running felt more natural than walking. That was the moment when running was not merely something I did, but became part of who I am. Now, I called this sermon Running in Such a Way after the language in the NRSV here. That same sentence, nearly 500 years ago, under the hand of William Tyndale, rendered it so simply, "So run that ye may obtain." We are called to our mission with purpose and focus and discipline. In modern vernacular, we might say, keep your eyes on the prize. Now, one way my running differs from Paul's analogy here is that I'm unlikely ever to get out of the bottom half of runners in my category without major sustained training to my changes in my training that simply are not likely to happen soon. In the end, though, those of us like myself are ultimately racing against ourselves. And Paul's point, I think, is not the competition so much as the discipline. Now, I did hit a personal goal some years ago running Broad Street. It took time building my distance over many weeks and months. It took work to strengthen my legs and my lungs to improve my pace. For the first so many years of running, I could do it because I had a support system around me. Students run, both the actual students and the other teachers and adults who were better runners than I, helped provide that structure. Over time, those supports gradually faded, and I learned to run and train more on my own, though having a partner certainly always helps. I've pushed the distance, and I have completed some half marathons, which are just over 13 miles. Yet when told by a full marathoner friend to just keep adding miles if I wanted to do the full 26.2 of a marathon, my reply has always been, my body just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't push to that distance very well. Even maintaining what I had at the time turned out to be elusive after a major change in my life about 7 years ago. And quite frankly, to be very honest with you, I was already taking in more calories and expending fewer. My weight crept up, making longer distance runs harder. In part, that was a response to stressors in my life. It had been exacerbated 8 years ago by a bicycle accident on Germantown Avenue that left my right radius shattered and me lying in an operating room. Yet other times there were very good reasons for the change in my habits. I had to let go partially of running for a time. My body and my energy were devoted to something else, or rather to someone else's. Young children are lovely, and they are also exhausting. It's a sacrifice made willingly and joyfully, but a sacrifice all the same. Just before the passage that was read, Paul wrote, "For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that I might by any means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel so that I may share in its blessings." It's easy to read that statement of Paul's as something noble simply because it comes inside book covers that say Holy Bible. Some of his readers might have appreciated that argument, but others might not have. Think about it this way. In today's language, if we thought a politician were doing what Paul describes, being a different person to different constituencies, we might decry it as pandering. A political advertisement, and boy, I'm glad the election's coming soon because I'm frankly tired of watching the ads. A political advertisement would splice half a sentence from one context next to a quote from a different context with a slow motion replay contorting the politician's face into something ugly, and a voiceover would question whether we could trust the politician. Now, this itself is a rhetorical sleight of hand. It clearly implies we cannot, but lets us come to the conclusion ourselves rather than coming out and saying so, which makes it harder psychologically for our minds to question the claim because it comes from inside our own heads. Perhaps I digress, but only slightly. Paul was writing what he did, mindful of the expectations of his readers and hearers about what is honest and dishonest rhetoric, a well-studied subject in the ancient world. He also closes this part of his appeal with the athletic metaphor that would have been familiar to the Corinthians. For all the rhetorical dancing around and back and forth, Paul is determined to get to this point. He moves the question from what rights he possesses to what rights he can lay down. He has a goal like the runner or the boxer. He has that direction. He has that discipline. Something has to be given up in order to gain something else. One does not just wander aimlessly on a trail when one is training or swing wildly in a boxing ring without striking one's opponent. One adapts to the challenges of the moment and the people with whom we find ourselves, and one stays that course over time. I finished a 10K, which is just over 6 miles this August. My time wasn't great, but I made it. I missed the half marathons, but I know my body isn't quite able to handle that right now. My frame, the joints, the connecting tissue only tolerate so many pounds over so much distance. And I've made some progress on that front. And I do hope to push my distance again next year. But two things come to mind as I move in the direction I want to. One is having someone or groups of people to run with. Shared interest and accountability do matter on the journey, even in what is nominally an individualist sport. The second is a shift in perspective. It's tempting to think of running or any exercise as a way to lose weight. And obviously it can be, though the catch, of course, is that adding muscle mass complicates how weight loss works. For me, the key was this. Instead of running so I could lose weight, I needed to lose weight so that I could run. Running is no longer the means to an end. Running is the point. There becomes a metaphorical race then of conditioning and so on to get to the literal act. And once I've inverted my view like this, I'm able to engage the required work in a new way. It means I have to give some things up that I like, or time I could be comfortable. It puts me, like anyone who is in any kind of training or rehab, in a strange relationship with pain. I have heard would-be joggers say they just don't feel like running right now. My reply is that I almost never feel like running right now, and I mean it. Convincing my body to stretch and move, my heart and lungs to speed up, my legs to pound the ground. My body protests. Gravity has its appeal. But putting one foot in front of the other, I have to move. We are going into winter soon, despite the mild weather of the last few days. And call me weird, but I like cold morning runs, ideally around 30 or 40 degrees. The first mile is always brutal. The frigid air cutting through the thin, breathable clothing, scraping at my nostrils and throat, my fingers flexing to maintain circulation. Another block, another quarter mile. My core starts to warm up, my head clears, and I find a stride. Focusing on what's in front of me now, perhaps the pain is worth it. Now, I must add that I am not a masochist, and some types of pain are how our bodies warn us that something is wrong. Certainly, we should listen to that kind of pain message and not abuse ourselves. I have taken breaks due to or to prevent injury. There is a time for rest. Indeed, God ordains the Sabbath precisely for this. There is no glory in self-inflicted injury or exhaustion. Pain by itself is not holy or redemptive. Yet there is still a way I can speak of embracing pain. There is a kind of discomfort with which I make peace and have a productive relationship. Maybe that sounds like an odd way of putting it, but it brings me to another word, sacrifice. With most goals that are worth setting, we will have to give up time and pleasures, not because they are necessarily bad, but because putting them down is the price of taking up something else. With running, that means choices about what and how much I eat or drink. It means putting one foot in front of the other quickly, even when every muscle and sinew fights it and wants to stop. It means carving out time to train, having the right attire or gear, planning the route and cleaning up after. But surely this is true more broadly than just physical running. Our relationships with our families and people around us take time to nurture and maintain. They require us, at least sometimes, to restrain our own selfish impulses. In our closest relationships, cultivating intimacy requires being open and honest, and anyone and everyone who has done that knows that sometimes it can feel uncomfortable and even painful to humble ourselves in that way, to process our own thoughts and feelings and speak and act in ways that support each other. Our church here holds together because so many little sacrifices and charitable acts happen from so many people here. Whatever challenges we face, we can overcome and prosper. The community continues, and it does so because so many of us here put in the work in small and often unseen ways. And so I say thank you to all who work quietly in the background. In workplaces, this can be true in a few ways. We may, of course, have career goals we work toward over time, and the comparison is apt. We seek training, skill sets, specific experiences. We make choices of what to give up to reach those goals. It's also true, though, when faced with ethical decisions. It is easier and may seem better for our careers sometimes not to rock the boat. And there we are faced with that dilemma of what goal takes priority. So too in the civic arena. Certainly a key feature of the mid-20th century civil rights movement was turning arrest into a badge of honor from something otherwise shameful. Some of the most horrendous examples are not as widely known as, say, Dr. King's arrest in Birmingham or Bloody Sunday, but many people in many decades have suffered beatings and cruel conditions in confinement. From Thoreau's very modest night in prison for refusing to pay taxes that would fund the US invasion of Mexico, to early suffragettes rotting in squalid jails never designed for women and who have largely been lost to our memory. Let us not forget their suffering as we go to voting booths Tuesday. In the moment, their choices might have seemed suspect. The goal, an impossible distance away. The cross always looks foolish on the morning of Good Friday. And let me not ignore the far more common and less glamorous effort I know that people in this building for years have engaged. It is also in the mundane, the slow, tedious work done in homes, small meetings, in building relationships and cultivating community, and engaging the levers of power in this world and in the city to bend our society just a bit closer to justice. Now, there's a story I remember from my youth, which is likely apocryphal, but it still tells us a greater truth. The version I heard was set in the political context of the Cold War era, set in that propaganda about the United States as the bucolic, shining city on a hill, the nadir of Christendom, and the Soviet Union as some kind of atheistic hellscape. Now, ignoring for the moment all the historical problems with that framing, the story has it that a Christian evangelical is in a prison at the mercy of a sadist who will stop at nothing to make him recant and abandon his faith and work. His tormentor cannot break him and shouts in exasperation, "Do you not know that I have the power to kill you?" The man replies, "Yes, and I have the power to die." The story concludes by having the man give the obvious explanation. By dying, he would become a martyr, and his blood would cover his ministry and give it a power that could not be killed. Forgive the melodrama of the story itself, but this is the logic of sacrifice. I mentioned William Tyndale earlier. Tyndale was living in the early 1500s in England. He had educated himself very deeply and disciplined his mind to become a scholar of language. He sacrificed and suffered greatly, ultimately being executed before he could finish his translation of the entire Bible into English. Less than a century after his death, one King James authorized scholars to take Tyndale's translation as their map, copying or imitating his passages, and produced a Bible that would have unrivaled influence in the English-speaking world for over 3 centuries. Something about a seed falling to the ground. And so it is with the crux of Paul's argument. What will we do with our freedom? Are we not, in so many ways, spiritually and otherwise, free? But to what end? Any sacrifice we make must be made freely, not as an obligation, or it loses its essential character. Yes, we are radically free, and yet invited to a radical way of using that freedom. We have the freedom to sacrifice as we progress toward our goal, not necessarily death or martyrdom, but still giving something up. Yes, freedom to die on a cross or in a sadist's prison, but also freedom to be hosed or beaten or jailed for blocking traffic in Birmingham, freedom to take the glaring spotlight of national news and the endless vitriol of unsocial media for calling out abuse by the rich and famous, freedom to face arrest merely for remaining seated at a Starbucks in Philadelphia, freedom to take a demotion or transfer for actually following your company's code of ethics and reporting misconduct, freedom to lock arms, support each other on the journey, giving and receiving of each other as a people walking toward the cross with a faith in an empty tomb. Freedom to run in such a way. As we move into communion today, the doors of the church are open.